Hi everyone, welcome to the See-Through Café. This event is part of South Dublin County Council's Social Inclusion Week, and we will look forward to welcoming our guests.
It is not a secret that in the last few months since we found ourselves in the confinement, it became so obvious how marginalized communities in Ireland have been affected on a much higher scale than the others, let's say, and among them, of course, is the traveling community. So I would like to speak about it too later, but now let me introduce our guests. It's Oein actually Oein.
Yeah, I'm not tense about it. It's Oein DeBhairduin.
DeBhairduin.
Yeah. Think of it like it almost sounds like a happy pirate.
So, but now, first of all, I would like to introduce our guests. It's writer Oein DeBhairduin, who is a creative soul with a passion for poetry, folk herbalism, and preserving the beauty of traveler tales, sayings, retellings, and historic exchanges. And an artist, the first professionally graduated artist among traveler community in Ireland, Leanne McDonagh, who we met last year with Francesca at the Create Summer School on Cultural Diversity, and are keeping talking since then. Both Oein and Leanne are co-creators of the book that has become a bestseller of this autumn. And we are so proud to have you both here. Thank you very much for being with us. Francesca.
Right. Thank you so much for being here. Today we're going to just ask you to talk about yourselves, talk about the book. Of course, if you'd attended our previous café, you would have felt the love of the people and the nice community feel to it, the possibility of sharing and also interacting. But we're really happy that by putting this video online, we'll be able to reach more and more people, hopefully, and there'll be more opportunities, hopefully, in the future to actually have that cup of tea that we're all really looking forward to so much. So to start with, I'd like to ask you about this book, which I got my hands on, Why the Moon Travels. This is a book that you worked on together, Oein being the writer and Leanne the illustrator. So just Oein, very open question. Could you tell me how the book came about, the idea of putting all these stories in writing came about? So in the introduction, you talk about oral storytelling. And I suppose when I read the book, my first feeling was to think about my own grandparents passing on generations and generations of stories that actually in my own culture are not written at all. And so feeling that this is actually a physical object was a real pleasure. So can you tell us more about why you felt it was important to put these stories into a volume and share it with everybody?
I think the seeds of the book itself came from because I just wanted to write a book. And I thought I wanted to write something I would feel would be beautiful. But the book that wanted to be written was the book about their traditional stories. Because if you think about what people know about travelers or understand about travelers, it's usually issue-based. It's actually not things about our culture or celebration, like things that are beautiful, things that hold us together and give us warmth and strength. And I'm quite blessed to grow up in a family and still be a part of a family that tells stories. It's an age part. Like my father would be well-known kind of poet and where we were from and a storyteller. My mother's people would tell stories, and it's very much a part of our identity and culture to pass them along. Now, obviously, the community has changed. We used to be primarily a nomadic community that lived quite closely knit, spent quite a lot of times around kind of communal fires and the kind of sense of community. But the tradition of telling stories and allowing the reflections and ideas and thoughts of generations behind us to pass through us still remains important. Because we don't actually own the stories. Our responsibility is to pass them on. And stories change and grow in us, and they come with their own biases, and they come with their own kind of their, I suppose, losses and their gains and their own kind of reinventions. But that's a part of the tradition, is that knowing that when we receive a story, the beauty of passing it on is that when we pass it on to someone else, it brings part of ourselves with it. So it's being a storyteller and being part of that tradition ensures that a part of you will always survive.
Thank you. I would also like to, maybe before we will submerge more into the book, just because our audience is majorly migrants, and the knowledge about traveling community in Ireland is quite superficial, I would say. You know, we know very little. We know what we know is full of media kind of manipulations and things that are not really giving us the understanding of the traveling culture and the traveling community in Ireland. I understand that it's not a place to kind of come into all the details, but maybe in few words you both could tell us what the traveling community is and how is it connected to the history of Ireland.
I find that a really interesting question, Evgeny, and I suppose I won't be able to answer it in a whole, but like, to give my personal response, I suppose just recently I was thinking about the history of the traveling community and what that meant to me. And I suppose as I was reflecting on it, I was thinking about my time in school and how travellers were represented, or the lack of representation travellers had within the curriculum in Irish society. And I suppose I was speaking specifically about a lesson I was experiencing in history class, but also geography. And I remember making certain associations with different events within Irish history and places of importance. And I remember associating them specifically with the travelling community. But I also remember at the time not being comfortable enough in myself to point them out to the teacher or to the class, because I was well aware I was the minority within that class. And I suppose reflecting on that, what I've realised is not only are we not visible within the Irish curriculum, we have almost been purposely written out of Irish history. So that's really like a bit of a thorn for me. And I suppose by creating this book with Owen and by creating my own personal art, I hope that I'm kind of adding and creating images and work that can now begin to go down in history, hopefully. Doesn't really answer your question, but...
No, I think it puts it into context of how one of the things that people often ask travellers about that don't seem to ask the majority population in Ireland is, where have you come from? And no one actually quite knows where any of us come from, so the exact way we come into being. But what we do understand from several genetic studies and reviews and research is that early Ireland, primarily people were both clannish, but also either very directly nomadic or semi-nomadic. So nomadism was seen as to be the set approach of a human identity, expression and movement. And then with colonizations and I suppose the increasement of kind of urbanization, many people settled, and travellers are the people who continue to move. And one of the most popular narratives, what I always find really interesting, that Ireland's kind of change and shifts around the time of the Cromwellian kind of wars, is that travellers were the people who refused the English shilling and continued to move. And I thought this was really interesting because it was almost in one way that Ireland was saying, we recognise, although it's obviously fraudulent, we recognise travellers as being these patriots who decided they would not live under English rule, but we now hate them because they don't live under English rule around the colonisation. So in one way that I always thought going, well, shouldn't you be celebrating us then, shouldn't you? We're the people who resisted. And they say that you're from this and you resisted this. At the same time, that's what they came to punish people for. So even in the errors explanations that were often given, there was a lot of kind of strength there, but it was just manoeuvred and changed. But we do know that around 1,000 years ago, our community had a distinct branch away from the majority community. But I do know my people sees the wider community as being from us rather than us from them. And rather than us being like 50 years behind the general population, we're on two different roads. Because we're often contrasted quite distinctly with kind of going, oh, that's like the settled population 30 years ago or 25 years ago. And kind of, you're setting yourself up as the primary kind of the achievable goal. And in fact, what you hold as a standard isn't actually what other people want. Because even when it comes to land and the ownership of land and how Irish people are absolutely fascinated with that. When I purchased with my partner our first home in 2011, my father said to me, going, you are the first generation of our people to ever be at risk of being homeless, because we self-accommodated. And this idea of owning land, even to my father, is quite a confusion. You can have responsibility of land. You can mind it. You can have animals on it. You can take care of it, and people have a sense that that's what you're doing with it. But to own a piece of land is quite an unusual concept. And I think that's where a lot of people come into direct conflict with travelers, because we see our spaces around us as passing spaces and places that we can live in and with. And other people see them only as objects of possession. And so I think those shifting ideologies are very interesting. But no one quite knows where we came from. But we are most certainly here. We're refusing in all ways to not leave. And even since the incredibly oppressive kind of policies of 1963, which unfortunately came with the statement of like the final solution, which is quite a heavy statement to come 20 years after the movements within Germany. Our travellers have survived, and our culture has changed and adapted, but remains one of the backbones of our strength and our communal connection, because it's not always where are you from, it's who are you from. So, and as long as you have a sense of connecting to your people and your culture and you're in the heart of it, I think we'll always be here.
Yeah, before I hang out to Francesca, I'm very agree. I think that, you know, the whole narrative, I was looking at a documentary about Schumers lately, and Schumer culture and civilization and the fall of the civilization and things like that. And the whole idea was that, you know, the civilization is created by settled people. So when the people have been settled, it's when they create a culture. And I think it's the whole product of the modern narrative that the settling is the creating of culture, while the nomadic is the savage, is something that is not able to produce culture, which is inherently wrong. Because I do think that the human civilization, if we have any other apart of human, we definitely consist of the constant dialogue of the settlers with the nomadics. And the nomadics were able to bring these things that they meet on the road and kind of enrich the cities, you know, to build this connection, this dialogue in a constant movement, and which was so important. And I don't understand why this anti-nomadic, in much broader sense than just anti-traveler, kind of modern, since 19th century movement, let's say, against any sort of nomadism. It is very visible in the Central Asia, it is very visible in the Northern Europe, it is quite visible all over the globe, maybe. And just answering to Leanne, I remember the very good motto about Arundhati Roy, that there is really no such things as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And I think that, you know, the very fact that you both are speaking out and that this book is existing now will never allow to unhear you or erase your experience. So thank you very much for that. Francesca, sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, my question is actually linked to what you're saying, because art sometimes is what brings up into vision things that are not seen. So probably I'd ask Leanne, do you think that your response through your art, not only within this book, but also your artwork in general, is a way to encourage visibility, to inspire new generations? So is there some activism in every piece that you do?
Yes, whether it's direct or indirect, I think there's always a little bit of activism in there. The first piece that I'm going to speak about that came to mind when you mentioned this, and just going back to the point that I just made, and that Owen just spoke about. So at a certain point in history, mid-1600s, the traveller population separated from the settled population. And that has been proven through DNA analysis. And I suppose just to give visibility and voice to our community, I'm creating a piece, a public sculpture, in celebration of our ethnicity status. And it's using that DNA analysis to create that piece. So I think by doing that, I'm really putting out there the fact that this is who we are. You've tried to get rid of us. You've tried to write us out of history, but we're here. We're stronger than ever, and we're not going anywhere. And we've got DNA analysis that proves that. So I think in that sense, I think it's great to use art as a medium to say, this is who we are and this is what we're about. I suppose in relation to Owen's book, the imagery created and the stories that Owen retold, I think, are a gorgeous representation of what it is to live through Irish society as a traveller. Like when I read Owen's stories, it truly brought me back to my childhood. Like one example I shared with Owen, I had never been to Connemara until we went to Create Summer School last year. But when I arrived in Connemara, I remembered one of Owen's stories, and it literally felt like I had been there. And even though I had never stepped foot in Connemara soil, just my connection to his story and how it related to my childhood, and that shared connection of being both members of the traveling community, it just felt like I was literally a part of that story and a part of that place. And it was really nice to be able to kind of connect to it in that way. And I feel like, and I suppose just in going on what I've heard from other people who have read Owen's book, who are also travelers, I think he's been really successful in sharing that genuine, authentic experience of what it is like to have grown up as a traveler in Ireland. And for that, like, I think Owen has just done an absolutely amazing job.
Yeah, and you're also, what the book told me something that I wouldn't have known, that it was the first time that it's a traveler person writing for the traveling community, rather than the story being told by the settled people about another community that they don't belong in. I think it says it here, the first collection of folk tales written by a traveler about travelers and illustrated by a traveler. So in a sense, it is important that the stories are told. You're talking about representation earlier, and it's true. It's a true story. It feels very real because probably it's told by someone who's heard it and is able to pass it on, like in true oral storytelling kind of fashion. Can I ask another question, Evgeny?
Of course.
I also have a language question, probably for Owen, and it's about the gammon language. So there is mention of the language throughout the book. How important is it for your book to have gammon as part of every story? So the importance of the language really for the community and for this book in the specific.
I found it absolutely essential, because how I first started the book was that I would record myself speaking. So I wanted to maintain that oral tradition, the idea of going, it is a spoken form. And when I would say things like, boy, I would say Subline, and I'd say the house, I would say Kenya, because they would be, if I'm telling the story to someone I know and it's in part of my family, this is how I would say it. So I didn't want to be editing the stories for this like settled kind of gaze. I just wanted it to be as authentic as it wanted it to be. So that's how the language kind of came out. But it did take a little bit of leg room. I wanted to make sure that it was respectful, because there's a lot of protection around the language. I ensured that I shared with people, kind of going, is because it's not formalized around scripting. So they're going, does this make sense? Does this approach make sense? There's even things kind of going, we don't actually have a word for magpie traditionally, because magpies only started coming to the country in the last 300 or so years, and they migrated from Wales. And so what people know magpies as is the black and white bird. So there isn't a formal term. And I'm kind of going, that sounds so unusual, but it's so authentic, because it is the black and white bird, you know. And I just kind of what word can you use from it? And also there's words that we use within Gammon that they're also still within Irish, like Ulcaban, which is like the owl, Granny Oak for the hedgehog. And that was quite nice, because it shows and really affirmed to me that the language that we have is a part of the Irish structure, and it doesn't have to be this distant, unknowable thing. And and also it's something that has given me great strength to myself to know that we have a voice. That it's incredibly well actually researched. But if anyone is interested in it, you probably won't find it on Gammon or Cant, but you will find it under the title of Shelta. Yeah. And there's several PhDs and reviews and all this sort of thing, but they're all done externally. And the community's never had an opportunity to actually sit down going, let's gather things together. Rather than saying something's wrong or inaccurate, let's celebrate that it's different and that it has value. And one of the things I wanted to do is make sure that kind of going, if I was telling a story to my younger self, this is how I would tell it. And this is how it would be heard. But also there's little anomalies that travelers will pick up on in the stories, with knowing a different context, that while people in the wider community would read it one way, travelers would read it differently. I found that quite nice as well. Not having necessarily an in-joke, but knowing that there's a subtle narrative here moving through the story, that if you're off the community, you get it.
Yeah. So your secret words are in there, and it's really interesting to see also some of the similarities with Irish as well, and the authentic feel. I think there is something to be said for when things are in more than one language. It's because the person writing or speaking belongs to more than one way of talking and thinking and expressing oneself. And as I was reading these, you might be able to answer my question here. I felt like I was listening more so than reading. You know, I felt like someone was telling a story, and so I really get a feeling that they're oral stories rather than just a tale that is set there. So when do we have a podcast or movies or cartoons, or is there an audio version of this? Is there going to be?
Oh, there is an audio version, and it should be coming out hopefully by the end of the month. And actually going through that was quite interesting, because I wanted someone whose voice matched my sense of the stories. And my father, to give it a go, the man cannot finish the same story twice. Like halfway through the story, and now there's a giant, you know? And when you're reading from an audiobook, you try to keep the material as much as possible. And we did approach a few people within the community, and and even Michael Collins, who's an amazing actor, had signed up to it. Unfortunately, there was someone that passed away, so we ended up going to an alternative kind of line. But the accessibility to audio forms and to visual forms is very important to me, but also to create other forms, because some of my mother's family are deaf. And so we have a reliance on this kind of audio structure. So some people will move through kind of visual styles, other people will move to the tactile senses, other people will move to the oral traditions. I think the more we can diversify it and make it accessible to all people, the better it will be. Because like I was very hesitant around the idea of these stories, bar from one, which is Ermid's Gresco, hadn't been recorded before, because I was going through the archives and I didn't want to put something out that had already been I suppose taken by a settled view, because I didn't want to create this like unnecessary conflict. But I wanted to also, if I had an opportunity to share something that isn't out there. And and that I think brings it is a hesitation around, if this is the first time it's being recorded in this way, are you settling the story? Are you fixing it? And to make sure as much as possible going, if you retell this story, you have full freedom to retell it whatever way you want to, as long as the three things are kept. One is that you share where it came from, that you share it as openly as you can, and that whoever receives it has the responsibility to pass it on. And I think that is one of the distinct things within our culture, is that the idea of these stories aren't just they belong to me, they're my stories, is that they're the stories that belong to us all. But once you get them, there's a need to share them. And that's one of the things I really wanted to around Leanne's work, is that the only thing I had in my mind is that the accessibility was around like black and white, because of the idea of it's so accessible. And then the sketchiness is about the idea of so many of these stories were told around campfires. And I wanted to almost the wisps of fire, you know, and smoke. And that was and then after that was like kind of going, these are now your stories living in your heart and in your head. You're free. So like absolutely. And I was really excited seeing them grow. But the idea is I would have seen things so very differently, and someone else reading would see it so differently. And that's the beauty of the story, is that you actually are creating it in yourself. And to have the ability, like Leanne does, actually to share it that way, I think is absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Because there's aspects of the stories that I didn't pick up on the way that she did. And I thought, okay, you know, even how there's the story of with the wishing well. And one of the things that came through obviously was the dance itself. And what I had always focused on in the story, because my grandfather had a limp, my father had a limp, and I had a limp, when we were walking. And what I remember most about the story is that she didn't cast aside the walking stick; she tucked it under her arm. So it wasn't suddenly that she was cured. It wasn't that like suddenly her experience had been washed away. And like this magical miracle had happened. Is that like she was contented who she was, you know? And for Leanne that came through as the dance, and I just thought it was quite nice.
Mm-hmm. I think that was great, Owen. Like I really loved the fact that you allowed me that freedom. You know what I mean? It was really amazing. I hadn't worked that way in years, and to be just given complete freedom with them was amazing. So thank you.
Oh no, thank you. Jesus, like John, co-creating.
Can I touch just on the use of gammon in the book also, guys, if that's all right? Like, I completely agree with Owen. I think we're of a generation where we used these words kind of intermittently within our everyday language. And how Owen used them is how I also would have spoke them growing up. And somebody asked me about this recently, because I also try and title my art pieces as much as I can with little words that I would have used growing up. And I think it's really important to try and record them, so that we do have them for future generations. And I think this book is going to be an amazing asset for people going forward. And I know you said that it's not really a secret or hidden language. Own, if you want to find it, you will find it out there, but you do have to really search.
Yeah.
I don't think our next generations going forward should have to search. I think that it should be readily available for them. So like, I would encourage more travelers to please follow in Owen's footsteps and begin recording and creating more literature and put it out there, so that we do have it for ourselves as much as anybody else, because I think that's really important.
I think as well, I think that the sympathy that comes from people not being able to speak Irish is quite unusual for me, because people go, let's put all this investment, let's teach it for 18 years in school, let's put these colleges together, let's put these summer groups together. It's so Irish is such an apparent form of the Irish identity and history and colonisation and how it was stripped away from people. And yet when it comes to gammon, people go, yeah, that's different. It's the same thing, you know. And like, it should be invested in. It should be researched by us as a community. We should be supported and resourced and given these tools of access as much as possible. Because I think that to take someone's language from them, you take a lot of how they view the world. Because being a traveler isn't just about nomadism; it's a way of perceiving our lives and each other. And like, to take other tools of that expression is so innately ours and so rawly passionate of our own spirit and who we are, is criminal, is absolutely criminal. But I do think there's a shift within the community. There's less fear around the language, the idea of getting out into the world, when people realize it has been out in the world for quite some time. The first book goes back to 1837. You know, like these languages and forms and regional differences and dialects have been well researched. Unfortunately, it has gone to the betterment of the wider community and not the travel community itself. And I think that especially people now who are teenagers, there's a huge one of, I want to use it. Even the idea of the shifting, was 10 years ago, people wouldn't have used the term minker. And now it's very common. The way they do, people going, I want to use one of our versions of our title, and not just be told that you're a traveler. Because again, being a traveler is fixated only on the nomadism. It doesn't touch on the idea of our expressions and our art and our creativity. And in fact, actually talking about art, Leanne, I don't know if you realize this, you were the first person to actually say that I was an artist. Because there I am in the background, making stuff, hammering away at things, you know. And when the first thing I can't remember what it was, but you're an artist. I was like, I don't know how that name is going to rest in me for a while. And then later on, I was like, yeah, I can take ownership of that. I can do that. You know? But it took a long while, because I think sometimes we're told this is who you are, this is your limited little box. And then someone can open it for you, you kind of go, and actually no, the edges of that box are not as tight as you thought they were.
Yeah, I know. And you know what you don't know is, so for those of you actually that don't know, I met Owen possibly 7-8 years ago. And when I first met him, I fell in love with how he spoke. And I remember one of the first things I said to him was, you need to write a book so that I can buy it. Little did I know that I would end up illustrating it. But anyway, as years went on, and as we kind of kept a dialogue going, I realized that Owen does a lot more than just, right? He creates jewelry and he creates beautiful photography and he creates just lovely pieces of art. And in that very moment, I can remember telling Owen, like, you are an artist, this is what artists do. And as you said, you didn't believe it. But what you also don't know is I've already had these conversations with Francesca and Evgeny, and I've been telling them all about you last year in Create Summer School and about how amazing you were and how much artist you were.
I already knew.
So own it.
Yeah, I Owen will own it. Yeah, I like that.
You know,
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
another thing that I would like to also kind of mention, I'm very conscious of time, but I understand you both are very aware, especially being artists, and you too, that you create a certain aesthetics in the book, and the influence of the book will be definitely resonating for years as it as a first book, and as it brings the folklore there too. So why did you pick this black and white gamma, and why did you work in this particular aesthetic? Was it like an idea, or you created it, you arrived to that conclusion together? I'm just wondering, because I am sure that will be, I still remember the pictures in the books that my mother was reading to me when I was a kid. You know, the influence of these books are very, very strong.
Well, I know one of the things I wanted obviously was the black and white, because and the idea of the wispiness would be the smoke of the campfire, and the black and white in itself is because people should have the freedom to color in the stories as they want to, you know. And then sometimes when we create a form or a structure and it can be very vibrant and full of color, that can also limit the image. Yeah, sometimes when it's black and white, you've just created the structures and the, I suppose, the skeleton of it, and people are allowed to take that for anywhere they want to take it. And but like the way it was styled and the way the images were selected, I just found absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure you can talk to that, Leanne.
Yeah. So I suppose just with Owen's guidelines, so like he was quite specific that it had to be black and white and kind of sketchy in style. And initially they were very sketchy in style, but I suppose the way in which they were created, I would like to think of them as kind of almost memories or flashbacks to what the story was. And I think that's exactly what they are. Like Owen tells stories that he gathered through his childhood. So they're, to me, flashbacks and memories of those stories. And hopefully I think I presented them in that way through the imagery as well. A lot of the time, like when I remember visually a story or try and recall something, I describe it like if you ever have a dream and you wake up in the morning and you've got all these different elements that you're trying to piece together to figure out exactly what happened. That's the type of visual I think I captured. So really, I suppose it's about representing that memory of those stories. So yeah.
Yeah, and in itself, I think like I retold a story that you then retold. You know, and that gives the feeling that that story has now been retold in a different way. And I love, actually, quite recently we were doing a workshop with a group of young children in school, and the freedom to create is so alive in younger people. And later on we limit ourselves so much, but they talk about dreams, that the idea of going, if you can dream and have a dream, you can create. So you are a creator, and you are a writer, and you are an artist, and you have all these things. And yeah, and I think we've tried as much as possible to honor the tradition of there is a sense within the older Irish tradition, especially in the Ulster cycles, that people have to tell this story exactly, because to lose something is to lose something vital. And our approach to the stories is very different. Is that kind of going, if something is lost to you, will be found if it is of such great importance, but your version of it is just as authentic. Only because someone once upon a time wrote it that way doesn't mean that was their story, that's their version of it. And I think sometimes people forget that all stories are just versions of the story. They're not the story.
That's a really important message also for, as we're talking about education and children, to give children even the ownership of saying, actually, your imagination is really important in co-creating the story. I'm passing it on to you. You're going to tell the story to your children and grandchildren, and God knows what that story is going to be like,
I think there's a gap within the overall Irish storytelling tradition that travellers were able to maintain to a much larger degree because of our kind of culture and the focus on storytelling, and that we haven't had so much time within these set structures. For instance, like loads of people now within the wider Irish community know the story of why the wren is king of all birds and the robin has red chest. And then I'm absolutely fascinated going on about what happened to everybody else. Like, what are the other stories? Where did this bird come from? Because like, where's this? What's the history of this hill? And those stories for a lot of people have absolutely been lost, and they've only seemed to be lost in the last 2 generations. Yeah. And I'm glad we were part of that, moving us in a direction that we focus on remembering and renewing rather than allowing it to slip away.
Yeah. What are your hopes for this book?
My hopes with the book would be that instead of us talking at each other, we actually start talking to each other. And it was a different way to start a very different type of conversation that needs to be had and heard and shared. And I hope that it moves in people as much as it has moved in me.
And Leanne?
That's lovely, and I agree, because like I've actually started new conversations with people who wouldn't have known how to question me about the community prior to this, and because they've now read the book, they feel like they have an in and they can speak to me about certain things, whereas before it would have always just been about different issues and challenges and barriers. But now they have actually an in to ask me about things that are genuinely and authentically traveller, which is great. And I suppose my hopes going forward would be that there would be more books to follow, and that more people would begin to write also and follow in Owen's footsteps.
So Leanne, what other events are coming up in the next couple of days?
Yeah, so this weekend, myself and Owen are participating in Mincéirí, and Mincéirí is an arts festival which is the first of its kind in Ireland also, and it's the celebration of all nomadic people. So we're really happy to be part of that, so keep an eye out for that.
Let's hope the book will be translated and re-edited and will have a long life. So congratulations, well done again. Thank you very much. Thank you, Francesca, for this co-curating
Thank you, Evgeny.
of the See-Through Café, and let's hope we will meet in 2021. Thank you very much for being here.
No, thank you for having us.
Thank you guys, it's always a pleasure to have a chat with you.